I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood in my own kitchen, holding a cup of tea I no longer wanted, and listened to my daughter tell me it was time for me to go. She didn't say it cruelly. That's the part that stayed with me longest. She said it the way you'd tell someone their parking meter was about to run out. Calm, practical, like it was simply a matter of logistics. Mom, we've been thinking. The house is a lot for all of us, and honestly, there are some really lovely seniors communities in Barrie. Clean, safe. You'd have your own space. I looked at her. Then I looked at my son-in-law, who was sitting at the kitchen table I bought at an estate sale in 1987, looking at his phone. I said, "This is my house." She said, "I know, but it's a lot of space for one person." I was not one person. I was a 67-year-old woman who had lived in this house for 31 years. I had painted every wall. I had planted the lilac bush by the back fence. I had replaced the gutters twice, retiled the bathroom myself with my friend Marguerite watching from the doorway with a glass of wine, laughing every time I swore at the grout. This was not a lot of space for one person. This was my life, laid out room by room. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and said I'd think about it. And I did think about it. I thought about it all night. I want to go back a little. Because the story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts about 2 years before, when my daughter called me from Calgary and said she and her husband were moving back to Ontario, that the cost of living out west had gotten impossible, that they were tired of renting, that they wanted to put down roots. She didn't ask if she could stay with me. She said, "We were thinking we'd come to Brampton for a while, just to get settled." I said yes. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. Her name is Ingrid. She's 41. She has her father's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a combination I have spent 4 decades both loving and being exhausted by. Her husband's name is Fletcher. He works in logistics. He is not a bad man. He has never been unkind to me directly. But there is a kind of person who makes you feel like a guest in your own home without ever saying a word out of place. And Fletcher is that kind of person. He reorganized my pantry the second week they were here. He said it was to help. I believe he believed that. They brought their dog, a large anxious golden retriever named Biscuit, who immediately claimed the couch I'd had since 2003. I told myself it was temporary. The first few months were fine, more than fine, honestly. It was nice to have noise in the house again. My husband Gerald passed in 2018, and after that the quiet had a weight to it that I never fully got used to. Having Ingrid back, hearing her voice through the ceiling, smelling coffee in the morning when I came downstairs, it helped. But things shift. That's the thing about arrangements that were never quite defined. They shift, and then one day you look around and you don't recognize what they've shifted into. By month 4, Fletcher had taken over the second parking spot without asking. By month 6, they'd repainted the guest room, my sewing room, without mentioning it first. Ingrid said they assumed I wouldn't mind. I said I didn't. I did. Fletcher started hosting his friends for hockey nights on Fridays. I'd come downstairs in my housecoat to get a glass of water, and there'd be 5 men I didn't know sitting in my living room with beer and chips, looking at me like I was the one who didn't belong there. I started going to bed earlier to avoid it. I told myself this was what family did. Accommodated each other, adjusted. Ingrid and I still had our mornings. Tea, the news, sometimes a walk if the weather held. Those mornings kept me from saying things I would have regretted. But then the money talk started. It began as a conversation about the furnace. The furnace needed replacing. I knew that. I'd been planning to deal with it in the spring. Fletcher brought it up at dinner one night as though it were a problem he'd discovered, a problem I'd been neglecting. He said the quotes he'd gotten were around $12,000. He looked at me when he said that, not at Ingrid, at me. I told him I had a contractor I trusted, and I'd been in touch with him already. Fletcher said his guy was better. We used his guy. I'm still not entirely sure how that happened. After the furnace, there was the roof. After the roof, there was a conversation about the driveway. Each time Fletcher presented the problem, presented the solution, and somehow I ended up writing a check for something that felt increasingly like it was being decided without me. I mentioned this to Marguerite one afternoon. We were walking along the Etobicoke Creek Trail, the one we've been doing together every other week for 15 years. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, "Sylvie, who owns that house?" I said, "I do." She said, "Then why are you asking permission to exist in it?" I didn't have a good answer. The shift happened the following Tuesday. I came home from my book club. We'd been reading a novel set in Newfoundland, a beautiful and lonely book, and found that the furniture in the living room had been moved. Not dramatically, just enough. My armchair, the green one I'd had reupholstered after Gerald died because I couldn't bear to get rid of it, had been pushed to the corner beside the window, away from the television, away from the lamp. Fletcher's recliner was in the center now, directly facing the screen. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I moved my armchair back. The next morning, Ingrid came downstairs while I was making oatmeal. She poured herself a coffee and then said carefully, "Mom, Fletcher was a little upset about the chair." I said, "It's my chair, in my living room." She said, "I know, but we live here too." There it was. We live here too, not we're staying here, not we're guests here. We live here. I stirred my oatmeal and didn't say anything. But that was the week I called my friend Audette. Audette had been through something similar 5 years ago with her son and his partner. She'd handled it differently than I was going to, but she knew the landscape. She also knew a very good real estate lawyer named Harold, who she'd used when she finally sold her place in Mississauga. I called Harold the next day, not to do anything, just to ask some questions. He explained to me what I already knew in my bones but needed to hear out loud. The house was mine, solely in my name. Gerald and I had purchased it together, but after he passed, it transferred to me outright. There was no legal complexity here, no shared title, no co-ownership, nothing that could complicate a sale. "Are you thinking of selling?" Harold asked. "I'm thinking of knowing my options," I said. "That's always a good place to start," he said. I sat with that for another 2 weeks. I went back and forth. I made lists, which is something I do when I can't decide anything. I write things down in 2 columns and look at them until the answer becomes obvious. One column said, "Reasons to stay." The other said, "Reasons to go." The reasons to stay column had things like, "Ingrid is my daughter. This is where Gerald and I built our life." The lilac bush. The reasons to go column started with 1 sentence, and I never needed to write anything else. I came downstairs for a glass of water in my own house and felt like a stranger. I called Marguerite. I told her what I was considering. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Sylvie, where would you go?" And that was when I told her about the co-op. There is a seniors' housing cooperative in Guelph, not a retirement community, not a nursing home, nothing like what Ingrid had described when she'd floated Barry at me like it was a kindness. This was a proper co-op. Independent units, shared garden, people my age who cooked their own meals and had opinions about politics and went to the farmers' market on Saturday mornings. I'd read about it in a magazine 2 years ago and clipped the article. I still had the clipping in my desk drawer, slightly wrinkled, under my passport and the deed to the house. I had looked it up again recently. There was a unit available. The week after Ingrid told me that Fletcher had been a little upset about the armchair, I drove to Guelph alone. I told no one. I said I was going to see a friend in Orangeville, which was true enough. I did stop for lunch with my friend Cecily on the way back. The co-op was exactly what I had hoped it would be. The unit was on the second floor, east-facing, with a balcony that looked out over a shared garden where someone had planted raised beds of vegetables and a row of sunflowers that were just beginning to open. The property manager, a composed woman named Harriet, walked me through everything without once making me feel like I was being assessed. I told her I was interested. She said there was a 2-week hold process. She gave me the paperwork. I just sat at home and put the paperwork in my desk drawer, under the deed, under the magazine clipping. That night, Ingrid told me it was time for me to consider moving out. She had clearly rehearsed it. She used phrases like quality of life and your needs going forward and a fresh start. Fletcher sat at the table and scrolled his phone. Biscuit was asleep on the couch. I listened to the whole thing. I held my tea. I said I'd think about it. I did not tell her that I already had. I want to be honest about what the next 2 weeks felt like because I don't want this to sound like I was cold or calculated. I wasn't. I cried. Not in front of anyone, but I cried. In the bathroom with the fan on, standing in the back garden at dusk looking at the lilac bush, which wasn't blooming yet, but would be in another month. I cried because this was my home and my daughter was asking me to leave it. I cried because Gerald had been gone for 6 years, and I still sometimes turned to say something to him and he wasn't there. I cried because I had spent my whole adult life making a home and then making room in it for everyone I loved, and somehow that had become the thing being used against me. But here's what I also knew. I was 67 years old, not 97. I was healthy. I was sharp. I had friends, a pension, and an RRSP that my financial advisor in Oakville had helped me manage carefully for 20 years. I was not dependent on my daughter or her husband for anything, and I had a right, not a courtesy, not a favor, a right to decide what happened to my own property. I called Harold again. I told him I was ready to list. He referred me to a real estate agent named Pamela, who had sold 3 properties on my street in the last 4 years. Pamela came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon while Ingrid was at work and Fletcher was at the gym. We walked through every room. She was professional and warm and did not ask unnecessary questions. She said she thought we could list at $819,000. Given what comparable homes in the area had sold for, she expected strong interest within the first week. I signed a listing agreement that afternoon. The sign went up on a Thursday. Ingrid and Fletcher were both at work. I want to tell you what it felt like to see that sign in the front yard. People might assume it felt triumphant or vindictive. It didn't. It felt quiet. It felt like a door opening that I had not realized was right in front of me. I stood on the porch for a few minutes with my hands in my jacket pockets, looking at it, and what I felt was something very close to peace. Ingrid came home at 5:30. I was in the kitchen making soup, a leek and potato, Gerald's favorite, which I still made sometimes because some habits are a form of love. I heard the front door open, heard her keys on the hook, heard her footsteps slow as she came down the hallway. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She said, "Mom, what is that sign?" I said, "I'm selling the house." The silence that followed was long. Then she said, "You didn't tell us." I said, "I don't need to tell you. It's my house." She said, "We live here." And I said gently, because she is my daughter and I love her. You've been living here. That's different. There were tears. There was a long, difficult conversation at that kitchen table that night, with Fletcher there too, and Biscuit wandering in and out looking confused. Ingrid said I was being impulsive. I showed her the date on the listing agreement. I had made this decision weeks ago quietly, while she was suggesting Barry. Fletcher said they had no warning. I asked him to remind me of the date they'd repainted my sewing room. He didn't answer. Ingrid asked where I was going to go. I told her about Guelph. I watched her face change. I think she had assumed I would make a decision in anger and regret it. I think she had not considered that I might make a decision in clarity and mean it completely. I received 2 offers within 8 days of listing. Both were above asking. I accepted the stronger one, $912,000 firm sale, 60-day closing. Pamela called me with the news and I sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Thank you, Pamela," and after I hung up, I put my hand flat on the table and felt the wood grain under my palm and said goodbye to it silently. Ingrid and Fletcher had 6 weeks to make arrangements. They found a rental in Brampton, a 2-bedroom on a quiet street, manageable rent, not far from Fletcher's office. I helped them pack some of the things they'd accumulated in the house. I did not help them pack the things that were mine. The last morning in the house, I walked through every room alone. I stood in the sewing room, pale yellow walls now, because they'd painted it a color they liked, and I'd never once said a word about it. I stood in the bathroom where I'd retiled the floor and the wall behind the tub. I stood in the back garden and put my hand on the lilac bush and told it, a little foolishly, that I was sorry I wouldn't be there to see it bloom. Then I closed the back door behind me and didn't look back. Marguerite drove me to Guelph. We took the 401 and then came off toward the city as the light was going golden in the afternoon, which felt more poetic than I deserved. We had the radio on low. She didn't say much. She knows me well enough to know that I didn't need commentary, I needed company. The unit was clean and empty and full of light. There were built-in bookshelves along one wall that I had not noticed on my first visit, and when I saw them, I stood in the middle of the room and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Marguerite put her hand on my shoulder and said, "There you are." I cried then too, but differently. It has been 4 months since I moved to Guelph. I want to be accurate about what that has looked like. The co-op is everything the magazine clipping promised. My neighbors include a retired high school principal who lends me books, a woman named Delphine who makes her own soap and gave me 3 bars when I moved in, and a former parks commissioner named Eugene who is gruff and funny and has opinions about every piece of municipal infrastructure in Ontario. We have a common room with good light and a decent coffee machine. On Wednesday evenings, a small group of us plays cards. My balcony looks out over the garden. The person who planted the sunflowers is a woman named Rita, who told me I'm welcome to plant something in the raised beds too, if I like. I planted garlic. Ingrid and I speak on the phone every week. It is careful, still. There are things we have not said to each other that live in the space between our words. But we are saying the other things, the ordinary things, and I think that is how repair works. Not in one conversation, but in the accumulated weight of many small ones. She has not apologized. I am waiting to see whether she will come to understand why one is owed. I am not holding my breath, but I am not closing the door either. Fletcher and I do not speak. I don't think either of us requires that we do. What I want to say, to anyone who has found themselves standing in their own kitchen feeling like a visitor, is this. The house I live in now is 1 bedroom. It is 340 square feet smaller than the house in Brampton. I have fewer things. I do not have the lilac bush. I didn't have the back garden or the reupholstered green armchair, which I gave to Marguerite because I knew she'd love it. But I sit on my balcony in the mornings with my tea, and there is not a single object in my field of vision that I did not choose, not a single arrangement that someone else made on my behalf without asking. I am 67 years old and I wake up every morning in a home that is mine in every sense of the word. That is not a small thing. That is, I think, everything.